Through the howling blizzard, the ex-SEAL and his dog wrapped a warm coat around the freezing old woman.
Yet her scared eyes stayed locked on the ruined wooden cabin ahead. Hello friends, I'm Wilder. I'm 55, and living out here in the wild has taught me that animals are our true family. Tonight's story is about a broken soldier facing his past to save a four-legged hero trapped in the storm. Where are you listening to this story from? Let me know in the comments, and please hit subscribe to join our pack.
The wind moving through the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana didn't just blow, it screamed.
It was late afternoon, but the sky had already bruised into a dark, heavy purple. A nor'easter was pushing down, threatening to swallow the valleys in a whiteout that could freeze a man's lungs in minutes. The snow fell sideways, erasing the horizon, erasing the trails, erasing the world.
I have lived in the wild for 55 years, my friends. I am Wilder. And sitting here by the fire, listening to the storms roll through these ancient pines, I have learned that nature does not care about our plans. It does not care about our regrets. But sometimes, the Great Spirit uses the storm to force us to stop running. Sometimes, the only way to survive the wilderness outside is to face the wilderness inside. Let me tell you about a man who was running from his own ghosts. Dakota Mitchell. Most people just called him Dak. He was a man built like the mountains he hid in. Broad-shouldered, standing over 6 feet tall, with hands rough like bark and a thick dark beard that caught the falling snow. Dak was a former Navy SEAL, a man who had survived the most brutal environments on Earth. But the scars he carried weren't just physical. They lived in his eyes. When you looked into Dak's deep, shadow-filled eyes, you saw a man who had witnessed too much death. A man carrying a weight that was slowly pulling him under. After the military, Dak had retreated into this frozen isolation. He was quiet, stoic, and kept his distance from the world because the world was full of people he was afraid he couldn't save. But Dak was not entirely alone. Walking beside him, pushing through the knee-deep drifts of snow, was Chief. Chief was a 4-year-old German shepherd, and calling him just a dog felt like an insult to the soul looking out from behind his amber eyes. Chief weighed 90 pounds, boasting a thick sable coat of black and tan that shielded him from the biting cold. He had the alert, upright ears of a creature that never missed a sound and a chest broad enough to break a trail through fresh powder. But Chief's true strength was his intuition. He was a rescue dog, pulled from a shelter by Dak 3 years ago. But the truth is, they had rescued each other. Chief understood Dak's silent agonies. He knew when the nightmares came before Dak even woke up. Chief did not judge the brokenness of the man holding his leash. He simply stayed, a constant grounding force of pure loyalty. On this particular afternoon, the storm was accelerating faster than any weather report had predicted. The temperature was dropping to 30 below zero. The math of survival was becoming painfully simple. They needed to get to the safety of Dak's cabin, and they needed to do it now. But the wilderness is a trickster. A massive pine had come down across the main trail, blocking their route. There was only one other way home, a shortcut. To take this path, Dak had to cross the property line of a vast, isolated plot of land. Land that belonged to a woman named Eleanor. I need you to understand what this meant to Dak. Taking this path was worse than walking through the blizzard. Eleanor was not just a neighbor, she was a mother. Specifically, she was the mother of Samuel, a bright, brave young man who had served alongside Doc. Samuel was the kind of kid who always smiled, the kind who believed in the good of the world. And Samuel had died in Doc's arms on a dusty road, thousands of miles away from these mountains. Dak had brought Samuel's folded flag back, but he had never found the courage to look Eleanor in the eye. He had spent years actively avoiding her property, terrified of the grief he knew he would see in her face. Eleanor was a woman in her late 60s. Before the tragedy, she was known for her resilient spirit, her warm, weathered hands that could grow anything in her garden, and her silver hair that she kept tied back in a neat braid. But the loss of her son had broken a fragile part of her. She had become a recluse, living alone in an old wooden cabin at the edge of the forest, aging quietly alongside her grief. Dak pulled his collar up against the wind. He kept his eyes on the ground. He just wanted to get past her land. He didn't want to look at the cabin. He didn't want to remember. But animals, my friends, they sense the things we try to ignore. Suddenly, Chief stopped. The massive German shepherd froze in his tracks, his ears swiveling forward like radar dishes. The fur along his spine stood up. He didn't growl, but he let out a sharp, urgent bark. Dak paused, his hand instinctively resting on Chief's head. "What is it, boy?" Through the blinding curtain of white, the world was a blur. But then, Dak saw it. Caught on the jagged end of a dead, dry branch, whipping violently in the howling wind, was a piece of red fabric, a scarf. It was flapping frantically, a stark slash of color against the endless gray and white. It looked like a silent, desperate cry for help. Dak moved closer, his combat boots crunching heavily in the snow. Beneath the branch, barely visible as the storm tried to erase them, were footprints. They were erratic, uneven. These weren't the steady strides of someone going for a walk. They were the desperate, dragging steps of someone who was exhausted, someone whose legs were giving out. The prints showed where a person had stumbled, fallen, and dragged themselves back up. They painted a picture of a terrible struggle from the direction of the cabin. A cold panic, sharper than the winter wind, pierced Dak's chest. "Seek, Chief," he commanded. Chief dropped his nose to the snow and surged forward, pulling the lead taut. Dak followed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The footprints led away from the tree line and toward the rusted iron fence that marked the boundary of the old property. There, slumped against the cold, unforgiving metal of the fence, was a mound covered in fresh snow. It was Eleanor. She was sitting on the frozen ground, her knees pulled to her chest, her small, fragile frame shivering so violently it looked as if her bones might shatter. She was not wearing a winter coat, only a thin cardigan that offered no protection against a storm that killed quickly and quietly. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue, and her silver hair was matted with ice. She had tried to walk away from her home to find help, but the storm had drained the last ounce of her strength. "Eleanor!" Dak shouted, his voice swallowed instantly by the roaring wind. He dropped to his knees in the snow beside her. The ghost he had spent years running from was now freezing to death right in front of him. All of his SEAL training, the instinct to save, kicked in. He reached out with his large, gloved hands, intending to scoop her frail body into his arms, to wrap his own heavy survival jacket around her and carry her to safety. "Eleanor, I've got you. You're okay," he said, trying to lift her shoulders. But the moment he touched her, something shocking happened. Eleanor didn't lean into his warmth. She didn't close her eyes in relief. Instead, with a sudden desperate burst of adrenaline, she fought him. Her weathered hands pushed against his chest, weakly but frantically. She was gasping for air, shaking her head. "No, no!" she choked out, her voice a fragile whisper against the storm. Dak looked at her face. Her eyes were wide, dilated with an absolute consuming terror, but she wasn't looking at him. She wasn't looking at the giant dog standing protectively over her. Eleanor was looking past Dak's shoulder. Her panicked, desperate eyes were locked dead on the old dark wooden cabin in the distance, barely visible through the raging blizzard. She was pointing a trembling finger toward the home she had just risked her life to flee. The wind was a living, breathing predator, howling with a fury that sought to extinguish any warmth left on the mountain.
As a man who has lived by the rhythm of the seasons, I can tell you that the cold has a way of stripping us down to our absolute truth. There is no room for lies when the temperature drops to 30 below zero. Dak, kneeling in the knee-deep snow, felt the raw, undeniable truth of the moment.
Eleanor was fighting him, pushing against his chest with hands that felt like brittle ice, her terrified gaze locked on the distant cabin. Dak did not force her to look at him. Instead, operating on the deeply ingrained muscle memory of a man trained to save lives under fire, he swiftly unzipped his heavy, military-grade survival parka. The jacket was thick, lined with synthetic down, meant to withstand Arctic blasts. He pulled it off, instantly exposing his own broad torso, clad only in a tactical thermal shirt, to the brutal teeth of the nor'easter. He wrapped the massive parka around Eleanor's frail, shivering shoulders, cocooning her in the residual heat of his own body. Eleanor grabbed the lapels of the jacket, her knuckles white and shaking. She did not care about the freezing wind biting into Dak's arms. She didn't even seem to register who he was, only that he was a lifeline. She pulled him closer, her face inches from his. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue, trembling uncontrollably as she forced the words past her chattering teeth. "The porch," she choked out, her voice a fragile, broken thread, slicing through the roar of the blizzard. "It collapsed. The roof came down. Scout, he's still in there." Tears spilled from her hazel eyes, freezing instantly into tiny trails of ice on her weathered cheeks. She wasn't crying for her own life. She wasn't afraid of the storm or the cold. Her terror stemmed from something far more devastating. She was a mother terrified of witnessing the death of the very last piece of her son. Scout was not just a dog. He was an 8-year-old Belgian Malinois, a retired military working dog who had served shoulder to shoulder with Samuel. "Let me describe this 4-legged veteran for you, my friends." Scout was a creature built of lean muscle and unwavering loyalty, though time had begun to soften his edges. The fur around his dark muzzle had turned a distinguished silver, and his left ear bore a jagged notch from a piece of shrapnel he had taken during a firefight years ago. He had the intense, intelligent eyes of a soldier who had seen the worst of humanity, but still chose to love fiercely. When Samuel's flag-draped casket had returned home, Scout had walked beside it, his head bowed, carrying the invisible weight of the war just as heavily as Dak did. Eleanor had taken the dog in, and over the years, Scout had become her shadow, her protector, and the living, breathing embodiment of her boy. To lose Scout under the crushing weight of a collapsed wooden porch would mean losing Samuel all over again. "He's trapped!" Eleanor sobbed, her freezing hands gripping Dak's thermal shirt with a desperate, crushing strength. "I couldn't lift the beams. I tried. He was crying, and I couldn't get him out. Please, you have to save him." Hearing those words, looking into Eleanor's pleading, terrified eyes, something inside Dak shattered. Time seemed to slow down. The howling blizzard faded, replaced by a deafening, ringing silence in his ears. The blinding white snow morphed into the scorching, unforgiving tan dust of a desert valley halfway across the world. Suddenly, Dak was no longer in the Bitterroot Mountains. He was back in the heat of an ambush. He could smell the acrid tang of cordite and copper. He could feel the heavy, sticky warmth of Samuel's blood pooling on his hands. He saw Samuel looking up at him with those exact same hazel eyes, the eyes he was staring into right now. Samuel had been gasping for air, pleading silently, and Dak had been utterly helpless to stop the life from fading out of his best friend. For 3 years, that memory had been a parasite feeding on Dak's soul. It was a suffocating guilt that made him hide in these mountains, drowning his pain in isolation, terrified to ever look Samuel's mother in the face. He had believed he was a ghost, a dead man merely occupying space among the living. He had convinced himself that he was a failure, a warrior who had lost his most important battle. But as Eleanor's frozen tears dripped onto his hands, the crushing paralysis of his PTSD began to shift. The guilt that had anchored him to the bottom of a dark ocean suddenly combusted, transforming into a fierce, blinding fire in his chest. The Great Spirit works in mysterious ways, my friends. Sometimes, the universe puts us exactly where our deepest trauma lives, not to torture us, but to give us a second chance. Dak felt the immense raw power of redemption flooding his veins. He could not turn back the clock. He could not pull Samuel from the dirt. But by the heavens, he could save that dog. He could save the mother. He would not fail his brother again. Dak reached up, taking Eleanor's shaking hands gently in his own, pressing them firmly against his chest to ground her. His dark, haunted eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time in 3 years, the shadow in his gaze was gone, replaced by the lethal, unbreakable focus of a Navy SEAL. "I hear you," Dak said, his voice low, steady, and vibrating with an absolute vow that cut straight through the chaos of the storm. "I am not going to let him die. I promise you, Eleanor. I will bring him back." Dak stood up, the brutal cold of the -30-degree wind lashing at his unprotected arms. But he didn't feel it. The cold was nothing compared to the fire burning inside him. He turned his gaze toward the dark, looming silhouette of the cabin in the distance. Through the thick, swirling curtain of white snow, he could just barely make out the devastation. The front porch, a heavy structure of thick pine logs and a snow-laden roof, had completely pancaked, transformed into a mangled, jagged heap of timber. And somewhere beneath that heavy, frozen tomb, a loyal soldier was waiting for rescue. The storm roared, challenging him, but Dak's hesitation was gone. The ghost was dead. The warrior had returned. The storm did not want to let them go.
Out here in the Bitterroot Mountains, we native people have long believed that the winter winds carry the spirits of ancient hunters, wild and fiercely unforgiving. As a man who has walked these woods for over 5 decades, I can tell you that when the temperature plummets and the whiteout blinds your very soul, the wilderness is testing your right to exist.
Dak understood this brutal test. He had just wrapped his heavy survival parka around Eleanor, but he knew that mere fabric would not be enough to save a frail woman whose core temperature was rapidly slipping into the fatal grip of hypothermia. He had made a promise to save the trapped dog, Scout, but he could not leave a grieving mother exposed to the teeth of the nor'easter. He needed a sanctuary. Dak scooped Eleanor into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, feeling as brittle and light as a bundle of dried winter reeds. The freezing wind screamed against his exposed tactical shirt, biting into his hardened muscles like a swarm of icy needles, but the fire of redemption burning inside his chest kept him moving. He pushed through the waist-deep snow, his combat boots cracking the icy crust with each determined step. Through the blinding swirl of white, his trained eyes scanned the chaotic landscape until he spotted a massive, ancient oak tree standing about 50 yards away from the fence line. It was a grandfather tree, a towering sentinel with a trunk so wide it would take 3 men to wrap their arms around it. Its thick, sprawling roots had created a natural hollow, a small, deeply shadowed pocket shielded from the prevailing winds. It was the only refuge the mountain was willing to offer. When Dak reached the grand old oak, he carefully lowered Eleanor into the hollow between 2 massive roots. The air was noticeably stiller here, the aggressive howling of the blizzard muffled by the thick, grooved bark of the ancient wood. Eleanor slumped against the trunk, her body convulsing with deep, violent shivers. Her eyes fluttered, half open and glassy, caught in that dangerous, hazy twilight between waking panic and the seductive, lethal sleep of freezing to death. Dak knelt beside her, checking her pulse. It was faint and erratic. He knew he was running out of time. He had to reach the collapsed porch before the weight of the snow crushed the life out of Samuel's loyal military dog, but if he left Eleanor alone in this hollow, her heart would stop before he ever made it back. Dak turned to the one companion who had never failed him. Chief stood at the edge of the hollow, his thick sable coat dusted with white snow, his amber eyes locked onto Dak with unwavering focus. The German Shepherd was a magnificent creature, descended from a long line of working dogs, possessing a primal intelligence that went far beyond mere obedience. Chief knew the scent of fear, the metallic tang of dropping adrenaline, and the quiet, creeping odor of approaching death. "Chief," Dak said, his voice a low, commanding rumble that cut through the whistling wind. He pointed a scarred finger at the shivering woman huddled against the tree. "Keep her warm. Guard." It was a simple command, but in the profound silence that exists beneath the noise of a storm, a sacred pact was made. We humans often forget that dogs are the descendants of the wolf, creatures of the pack who understand that survival depends entirely on protecting the weakest member. Chief did not hesitate. He did not need to be told twice. He stepped into the hollow, his large paws moving with deliberate, gentle precision. Chief approached Eleanor, lowering his heavy head to sniff her face, assessing her condition with his remarkable senses. Then, he acted. The 90-pound dog circled tightly and laid himself down directly across her freezing legs. He tucked his nose beneath his bushy tail, effectively turning his large muscular body into a living, breathing furnace. Chief's double-layered coat, a dense, woolly undercoat designed to trap heat, covered by a coarse, weather-resistant outer layer, acted as the ultimate thermal blanket. He pressed his broad back firmly against her fragile chest and abdomen, maximizing the surface area of physical contact to transfer his own vital body heat into her failing system. Eleanor let out a weak, ragged gasp as the sudden weight and warmth of the animal enveloped her. Her hands, pale and stiff as carved marble, rested limply by her sides. Chief noticed this. With a soft, sympathetic whine, he lifted his head and began to actively lick her exposed fingers. His tongue was rough and incredibly warm, moving over her knuckles, her palms, and her wrists, with persistent rhythmic strokes. This was not a random act. It was a deeply ingrained canine instinct to stimulate blood flow and rouse a fading pack member. The friction and the heat from his breath worked against the frostbite, slowly coaxing the stagnant blood back into her frozen extremities. For Eleanor, drifting in a half-conscious state of despair and physical agony, the sensation was a lifeline, thrown into a dark abyss. She had been drowning in the freezing terror of losing her son's final living legacy, but suddenly, the darkness was pushed back by the smell of wet pine, earthy fur, and vibrant, undeniable life. Instinctively, with the last reserves of her fading strength, she pulled her trembling arms out from beneath the parka and wrapped them tightly around Chief's thick, muscular neck. She buried her icy, tear-stained face deep into the ruff of his warm fur. Chief did not pull away. He accepted her desperate embrace, adjusting his weight to shield her even more from the stray gusts of wind that curled around the oak. He let out a long, deep exhale, and his breathing settled into a slow, powerful, and incredibly steady rhythm, up and down, in and out. For the broken mother trembling against the oak tree, that steady expansion and contraction of the dog's ribs became a metronome of survival. It was a calming, rhythmic drumbeat that spoke directly to her panicked heart. "You are not alone," the rhythm seemed to say. "You are part of the pack now. I have you." The frantic bird-like fluttering in her chest began to slow, syncing unconsciously with the steady, reassuring heartbeat of the great dog. The terror that had dilated her eyes began to recede, replaced by a profound, tearful gratitude. She held on to Chief as if he were the only solid thing left in a shattered world. Dak stood up, pausing just long enough to witness this beautiful, silent exchange. A heavy knot of emotion tightened in his throat. He saw the way the grieving woman clung to his dog, and he saw the absolute, unconditional devotion in Chief's amber eyes as he looked back at his master. The guilt that had haunted Dak for years felt distant now, replaced by a razor-sharp clarity. His pack was holding the line. Now, it was his turn to do his part. Dak gave Chief a single firm nod of approval. Then, he turned his back on the sheltered hollow of the ancient oak tree. He pulled his combat knife from its sheath, feeling the cold weight of the hilt in his bare hands, a grounding reminder of the task ahead. Squinting his dark eyes against the blinding horizontal snowfall, Dak lowered his shoulders and plunged back into the screaming heart of the blizzard, his boots carving a direct path toward the ruined snow-buried porch in the distance. He was coming for Scout. The storm howling across the Bitterroot Range did not merely blow, it hunted.
As a man who has watched the seasons turn for over half a century, I can tell you that the deep winter wilderness has a way of stripping away everything artificial, leaving only the raw, beating heart of survival. Dak waded through the blinding whiteout, his broad shoulders leaning heavily into the gale.
Every step was a battle against the thigh-deep drifts, but his mind was no longer clouded by the suffocating fog of his trauma. The ghosts that had chased him into this isolation were suddenly silenced by a singular, immediate mission. He reached the edge of Eleanor's property, his combat boots crunching over the buried pathway until the dark, jagged outline of the ruined porch materialized through the flying snow. The structure had completely surrendered to the nor'easter. The heavy, snow-laden roof had snapped the supporting pine columns like dry twigs, collapsing the entire awning into a chaotic, overlapping maze of splintered wood, rusted nails, and crushed shingles. Dak dropped to a crouch, his eyes scanning the devastation. The wind was deafening, a constant abrasive roar, but beneath it, Dak's trained ears caught a sound that made his chest tighten. It was a low, vibrating whimper, the agonizing keen of a creature trapped and hurting. Dak crawled forward, digging through the top layer of fresh snow with his heavy tactical gloves. He shifted a broken piece of lattice, and there, pinned in a narrow, dark cavity beneath a massive, solid oak purlin, was Scout. The 8-year-old Belgian Malinois was in a bad way. His thick fawn-colored coat was matted with ice and debris, and his back legs were completely trapped beneath the crushing weight of the fallen beam. Scout was a veteran of foreign sands, a highly trained military working dog who had leaped out of helicopters and tracked insurgents through pitch-black alleys. But right now, pain and freezing temperatures had stripped away his discipline. He was terrified, reverting to the primal defensive instincts of a wounded animal. As Dak's shadow fell over the opening, Scout's head snapped up. The dog's ears, including the one with the jagged shrapnel notch, pinned back against his skull. He bared his teeth, a row of sharp, menacing white fangs glinting in the dim light, and let out a deep, guttural growl that vibrated in his chest. He snapped his jaws at the empty air, warning this encroaching giant to stay back. Scout did not recognize the man wrapped in snow and darkness. He only recognized another potential threat in a world that was currently crushing him. Dak froze. He knew the psychology of a working dog better than most. A panicked, cornered Malinois in excruciating pain was a lethal weapon. If Dak reached in abruptly, Scout would bite, and a bite from those jaws could sever an artery, leaving them both to bleed out and freeze in the storm. Force was not the answer here. Dominance was not the answer. Dak needed connection. He needed to bridge the gap between the present nightmare and a past where this dog felt safe. Slowly, deliberately, Dak dropped to his knees in the snow. He raised his hands where Scout could see them, moving with the agonizing slowness of a ticking clock. Then, biting his lip against the stinging wind, Dak unfastened the Velcro straps of his heavy, weatherproof gloves. He pulled them off, tossing them aside, exposing his bare, scarred hands to the sub-zero temperature. The cold instantly bit into his flesh like a swarm of angry wasps, but Dak needed his skin exposed. He needed the dog to smell human warmth, human vulnerability, not synthetic rubber and Kevlar. He lowered his bare hands into the cavity, palms up, stopping just inches away from Scout's snapping teeth. The dog growled louder, his body shaking violently from both the cold and the adrenaline. Dak took a slow, deep breath, centering himself, reaching back into the locked, painful vaults of his memory. He pictured Samuel. He remembered the dusty staging areas, the scorching heat of the desert, and the quiet, specific way Samuel used to speak to his four-legged partner right before a door breach. Samuel had always used a calm, almost musical cadence, mixing English with specific Dutch commands standard for Malinois training. "Easy, brother," Dak whispered, his voice pitching low and steady, cutting under the howl of the wind. He kept his bare hands perfectly still. "We hold the line here, rustig." The Dutch word for calm hung in the freezing air. Scout's growl hitched. His wide, panicked eyes darted to Dak's face. Dak moved his hand a fraction of an inch closer, his voice dropping into the exact rhythm he had heard Samuel use 100 times. "Blythe, stay, Scout. I've got your 6. I've got you, buddy." The transformation was miraculous. The cadence, the familiar words, the bare, non-threatening hands offering warmth, it all bypassed the dog's pain-addled panic and struck a chord deep within his disciplined mind. Scout's rigid muscles trembled, and the aggressive snarl slowly faded. He closed his jaws, letting out a long, shuddering sigh that puffed a cloud of white vapor into the freezing air. His notched ear flicked forward, and he tentatively stretched his neck, pressing his wet, icy nose against Dak's bare palm. The dog whined, a soft, heartbreaking sound of surrender and trust, recognizing the ghost of his handler in the voice of the man kneeling before him. "Good boy," Dak choked out, a sudden burn of tears mixing with the melting snow on his face. Good boy. But the danger was far from over. The oak purlin was incredibly thick, a structural beam designed to hold the weight of a heavy winter roof. Dak shifted his position, bracing his combat boots against the solid stump of the ruined porch. He wedged his bare hands underneath the jagged, splintered edge of the massive beam. The wood was frozen, slick with ice, and covered in sharp, punishing shards. Dak took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the freezing air, and channeled every ounce of his seal conditioning. He pushed upward. At first, the beam refused to yield, feeling as immovable as the mountain itself. Dak ground his teeth, a guttural roar ripping from his throat as he engaged his core, his shoulders, his back. He pushed with the desperation of a man trying to lift the weight of his own guilt. The heavy timber groaned. Then, with a sharp crack, it began to shift upward. The raw, jagged splinters of the frozen oak bit deeply into Dak's bare palms. The skin tore, and warm, crimson blood began to flow, staining the white snow and the dark wood, but Dak didn't stop. He embraced the pain. It felt like penance, like a necessary sacrifice to balance the scales of the past. He forced the beam higher, creating just enough clearance. As the heavy wood lifted and the snow cascaded away, a sliver of ambient light pierced the darkness beneath the ruins. It caught the glint of something metallic hanging from Scout's heavy tactical collar. Dak's eyes widened, his heart skipping an agonizing beat. There, lashed securely next to the dog's rabies tag, were 2 dull silver rectangles. Dog tags. Samuel's dog tags. Dak held the crushing weight of the timber above him, his bleeding hands trembling, his muscles screaming in protest. He stared at the names stamped into the metal, the letters catching the faint light of the storm. It was as if Samuel was right there, looking back at him, whispering through the howling wind that it was okay to let go of the past, as long as he held on to the present. With the crushing weight of the oak purlin finally lifted, the true test of survival began.
How, my friends? As someone who has spent a lifetime observing the delicate balance between life and death in the wild, I know that the moment of rescue is often the most dangerous. Adrenaline fades, the cold seeps deeper into the marrow, and the body realizes exactly how much damage it has endured. Dak did not let the adrenaline fade. With blood still dripping from his shredded palms, he carefully reached into the icy cavern and slid Scout free from the wreckage. The 8-year-old Malinois let out a sharp, breathless whine. His back left leg hung at an unnatural angle, bruised and swollen, unable to bear any weight. But the dog did not snap or growl this time. He pressed his cold, wet nose into Dak's neck, offering a silent, trembling surrender. Dak scooped the 60-pound military dog into his arms, holding him tight against his chest. Scout was remarkably heavy, carrying the dense muscle of a working dog, but to Dak, lifting him felt like lifting away a boulder that had been sitting on his own soul for 3 long years. Holding Scout securely, Dak turned back toward the howling fury of the nor'easter. The wind whipped at his face, trying to blind him, trying to push him down into the endless white, but he moved with a relentless, mechanical determination. He retraced his steps, his heavy combat boots plunging into the deep trenches he had carved earlier, until the towering, dark silhouette of the grandfather oak tree emerged from the blinding storm.
Inside the hollow, the scene was a testament to the primal, unbroken bond between human and animal. Chief was still there, a massive mound of sable fur covered in a layer of frost, his broad body wrapped protectively over Eleanor's frail legs. When Chief heard Dak approaching, his ears swiveled, and he let out a low, acknowledging woof, never breaking his position over the freezing woman. Eleanor stirred, her glassy eyes blinking against the stinging snow. When her gaze focused on the bundle in Dak's arms, a profound, shuddering gasp tore from her throat. "Scout," she whispered, the name carrying all the desperate love of a mother, seeing her child's best friend pulled from the grave. Tears flowed freely down her weathered cheeks, but this time, they were not tears of terror. They were the warm, heavy tears of a miracle realized. Dak knelt beside the hollow, his bloody hands gripping Scout tightly. "We have him, Eleanor," Dak shouted over the gale. "But we have to move now. We have to get inside." He gently set Scout down in the snow, leaning the injured dog against Chief's warm flank. Then, Dak reached out and pulled Eleanor to her feet. She was incredibly weak, her legs shaking uncontrollably, but she clung to Dak's arm with a newfound desperate strength. Together, this ragtag wounded pack began the final agonizing march toward the cabin. Dak supported Eleanor's weight on one side, while Chief walked closely on her other side, offering his sturdy 90-pound frame as a living crutch. Scout hobbled behind them, leaning heavily on three legs, his golden eyes fixed on Dak's broad back, trusting the man who had spoken his handler's language. They reached the heavy wooden door of the cabin. Dak kicked it open with his boot, and the four of them spilled over the threshold, collapsing into the dark interior. Dak used his shoulder to slam the heavy door shut behind them, throwing the iron deadbolt into place. The contrast was immediate and deeply jarring. Outside, the blizzard was a roaring, chaotic monster trying to tear the world apart. Inside the cabin, it was entirely still. The silence was absolute, a heavy, dusty quiet that felt like stepping into an ancient tomb. The air was freezing, holding the deep, penetrating chill of a house that had lost its warmth hours ago. But it was dry, and the wind could no longer reach them. The structure was a classic, sturdy Montana log cabin, smelling faintly of old pine, dried lavender, and the metallic tang of wood smoke lingering in the chimney. It was a fortress against the storm, but they needed heat, or the cold would simply finish the job the blizzard had started. Dak did not pause to rest. He carried Scout to a thick, woven wool rug, positioned perfectly in front of the large, river-stone fireplace in the center of the living room. He laid the injured veteran down gently, then moved to the hearth. His military training took over, his bloody, shivering hands working with frantic precision. He found a stack of dry cedar kindling and a pile of split birch logs. He arranged them quickly, striking a long wooden match against the stone. At first, the small flame flickered, fighting against the damp chill of the room. But then, it caught the dry moss and cedar. The fire leapt upward, crackling and hissing, casting a sudden, brilliant amber glow across the darkened room. The warmth radiated outward, an invisible, life-saving wave that touched every corner of the frozen cabin. Dak moved back to Scout. The dog's leg was badly bruised and bleeding from a deep laceration caused by the splintered wood. Dak looked down at his own torn thermal shirt. Without a second thought, he gripped the hem and ripped a long, wide strip of the thick fabric. He wrapped it tightly but carefully around Scout's injured leg, applying firm pressure to stop the bleeding, murmuring the same calm Dutch commands that had soothed the dog earlier. As Dak finished tying the makeshift bandage, Chief approached. The massive German shepherd sniffed the wounded Malinois thoroughly, his nose mapping the scent of blood and trauma. Then, in a beautiful display of pack instinct, Chief circled once and laid down with his broad back pressed firmly against Scout's spine, sharing his immense body heat to chase away the older dog's shivering. Dak sat back on his heels, his chest heaving, the blood from his palms beginning to dry in the heat of the fire. He looked up. The roaring flames in the hearth were casting dancing shadows on the stone mantel above. Lined up perfectly across the heavy wooden shelf were several framed photographs. The firelight illuminated them, bringing the faces out of the darkness. It was Samuel. Samuel in his dress whites, smiling that bright, unbroken smile. Samuel as a young boy, holding up a fish by the river. Samuel in his combat gear, kneeling in the sand with a much younger, darker-furred Scout leaning against his shoulder. Eleanor had dragged herself to a rocking chair near the fire. She sat wrapped in Dak's survival parka, the heavy shivering slowly subsiding as the room filled with heat. She looked at the mantel, and then she looked at the two dogs resting together on the rug, and finally, her eyes settled on Dak. There were no words spoken. The howling of the storm outside was entirely muted by the crackling of the dry birch wood. The ghost that had haunted this cabin and the ghost that had haunted Dak's soul seemed to step back into the shadows, repelled by the light. In this small, silent room, surrounded by the fierce, unforgiving wilderness, life was slowly, undeniably reviving. The Great Spirit teaches us that no storm lasts forever.
As a man who has watched the skies over these wild lands for 55 years, I have learned that the most profound silence does not come before the tempest, but immediately after it. When the wrath of the wind finally exhausts itself, the earth takes a slow, deep breath.
Inside the heavy log walls of the cabin, that profound, sacred silence had finally arrived. The nor'easter that had sought to bury them all had weakened, its deafening roar fading into a hollow, defeated whisper against the eaves. The darkness of the long, terrifying night began to lift, yielding to the slow rotation of the earth. Dak sat, huddled in the furthest, darkest corner of the room, his broad back pressed hard against the rough-hewn pine logs. He had not slept. He had spent the remaining hours of the night keeping the fire alive, feeding it split birch, and watching the flames dance while the rest of the room surrendered to exhaustion. His hands, wrapped in torn strips of fabric to cover the deep, splintered gashes, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. But physical pain was a familiar friend to a Navy SEAL. It was the other pain, the crushing, suffocating weight of guilt that kept him pinned to the shadows. He watched the steady rise and fall of Eleanor's chest under his heavy survival parka, where she slept in the rocking chair. He had done what he came to do. He had saved her. He had pulled her son's loyal dog from the jaws of the mountain. His debt for this night was paid, and the old familiar instinct whispered that it was time for the ghost to disappear again. He did not belong in the warmth of a family home. He belonged out there, in the cold, where his failures could not hurt anyone else. Slowly, trying to make absolutely no sound, Dak gathered his frozen tactical gear. He pulled his torn, blood-stained boots toward him, intending to slip out the heavy oak door before the first light could fully expose him. But nature, my friends, always has a way of stopping us when we are walking down the wrong path. Outside the frost-covered window panes, the sun breached the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. It was not a harsh, glaring morning light. Instead, the dawn broke in a brilliant, breathtaking flood of pure amber. The golden rays sliced through the thick, icy condensation on the glass, illuminating the cabin with a warm, honeyed glow. The light spilled across the worn wooden floorboards, creeping steadily until it touched the center of the room, right in front of the stone hearth where the fire still popped and crackled softly. A gentle soundtrack to the waking world. The amber light bathed the thick wool rug, illuminating a sight that made Doc freeze in his tracks. There, bathed in the warmth of the hearth and the morning sun, lay Chief and Scout, two dominant male dogs, one a fierce protective German shepherd of the mountains, the other a battle-hardened Belgian Malinois of the desert, had completely surrendered their primal instincts to the bond of the pack. They were lying side by side, their bodies curled together in a yin-yang of sable and fawn fur. Most remarkably, they were resting their heavy chins over each other's necks, breathing in perfect, peaceful unison. The suspicion and fear of the previous day had been entirely washed away by mutual survival and caring. "Don't," a voice whispered softly through the quiet room. Dak flinched, his hand pausing over his boot. He looked up. Eleanor was awake. She was sitting up in the rocking chair, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, her face illuminated by the amber sunrise. The terror that had gripped her in the blizzard was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, gentle strength. She was looking right at him, her hazel eyes, the exact same eyes Samuel had possessed, locking onto Dak's dark, haunted gaze. "I have to go, Eleanor," Dak murmured, his voice rough, thick with the gravel of unshed tears. "The storm is breaking. You're safe now. I shouldn't be here." Eleanor slowly shook her head. She pushed the heavy survival parka back and stood up, her movements stiff but steady. She walked across the amber-lit floorboards, stopping just inches from where the giant, broken soldier sat huddled in the shadows. She slowly raised a weathered, frail hand and pointed toward the hearth, toward the two dogs sleeping peacefully, and up toward the mantel where Samuel's photographs watched over the room. "Look at them, Dakota," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the immense, undeniable gravity of a mother's truth. "Look at what you did. You didn't just save my life. You brought my family back together." "I couldn't save him," Dak choked out, the words tearing from his throat like barbed wire. The confession he had held inside for 3 years finally ruptured. He pressed his face into his bandaged hands, his broad shoulders shaking. "I held him, Eleanor. I held Samuel, and I couldn't stop it. I'm so sorry. I've been so sorry every day. I don't deserve to be in the light. I'm just a ghost." Eleanor knelt on the floor in front of him. She reached out, her warm, wrinkled hands gently grasping Dak's large, bloodied, bandaged ones, pulling them away from his face. She forced him to look at her. "My son loved you," she said firmly, tears welling in her own eyes, catching the golden light. "Samuel told me you were his brother. He would be absolutely heartbroken to see you living as a ghost in these woods, punishing yourself for a war that takes without asking. You carried his flag back to me. Last night, you carried his dog back to me. You are not a ghost, Dakota. You are the man my son trusted with his life." She squeezed his hands, her thumbs brushing against his bandages. "I forgive you," she whispered, the words hanging in the air like a sacred blessing. "You don't owe me anything anymore, but I am asking you, please, stay. We have both been alone for far too long." For the first time in 3 long, bitter years, the dam broke. The stoic Navy SEAL, the man who had trained himself to feel nothing, bowed his head and wept. Deep, racking sobs shook his massive chest. The tears fell freely, washing away the desert dust, washing away the blood, washing away the suffocating guilt. He cried for Samuel. He cried for the years he had lost to his own darkness. And he cried because, for the first time, he felt the terrible, beautiful weight of being forgiven. Dak slowly lifted his head, his face wet, his chest feeling lighter than it had in a lifetime. He crawled out of the shadowy corner, moving into the warm, amber pool of sunlight spreading across the rug. He reached out with his trembling, bandaged hands. He rested one hand gently on Chief's thick sable shoulder, and the other on Scout's silver-dusted head. Both dogs stirred, opening their eyes. Scout let out a soft, contented sigh, and as he shifted, the amber light caught the silver medal of Samuel's dog tag resting against the dog's chest. It gleamed brilliantly, a bright, undeniable spark of life. Dak felt the steady, rhythmic breathing of the 2 dogs beneath his hands. He felt the heat of the crackling birch wood. He looked up at Eleanor, who was smiling down at him through her own tears. Sitting there in the amber sunrise, surrounded by the pack he had risked his life to save, Dak finally understood. The storm was over. His running had come to an end. He was home. We all have storms we are walking through. We all have ghosts that tell us we do not deserve the light. But the lesson of this mountain is simple. Forgiveness is the truest sanctuary we can build. When we choose to forgive others, and when we find the courage to forgive ourselves, we step out of the cold and into the warmth of a new beginning. Just like Chief and Scout, 2 warriors resting together by the hearth, we are meant to heal together. We are meant to be a pack. If this story warmed your heart tonight, please share it with someone who might be walking through their own storm and needs a little light. Leave a comment below and tell me your thoughts, and please subscribe to our channel so we can spend more time by the fire together. May God bless you and your families, both the 2-legged and the 4-legged ones.
If you believe in the healing power of forgiveness and the absolute loyalty of a good dog, please type Amen in the comments below. Stay warm, my friends, and remember that the sunrise is always waiting.